From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
First of all, thank you to the Copyright Office for giving us this room at the last minute. We were going to have it in the law library, but the space was a little small, so thank you, Copyright Office, for coming through. And I'm so glad you're here for this lunchtime discussion of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. I clearly have been under a rock because until Janine Calley, our communications person in law library, alerted me that The Legend of Sleepy Hollow is trending right now because of the TV series, and so I'm glad to be brought up to date. But I first heard about Professor Grossman's presentation at American University through the Books That Shaped America series, and Nancy Davenport, who used to work at the Library of Congress, who's now university librarian at American University, said, oh, this Professor Grossman is so engaging. We really enjoyed his presentation. So click, click, click. We have a great relationship with the Washington College of Law at AU. So that's why he's here today, because of our wonderful relationship. And we're just so glad you're here.
Delighted to be here.
Louis Grossman teaches and specializes in American legal history, civil procedure, and food and drug law at American University's Washington College of Law. And he is formally an associate at the DC firm of Covington and Burling. Our own law librarian of Congress, David Mao, is also an alumni of Covington and Burling.
Roberta Schaefer.
Roberta Schaefer,
yeah.
And so we're glad to have the more Covington and Burling staff here. So Professor Grossman's latest work includes Food and Drug Law Cases and Materials, now in its third edition. And he is writing a book, and I love this title, tentatively titled, You Can Choose Your Medicine, Freedom of Therapeutic Choice in American Law and History. So we'll be anxious to hear about that, maybe for a return presentation. So I'm now going to turn it over to Professor Grossman, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks. This is truly one of the more exciting invitations I've received in recent years. Thank you so much. My parents are even more excited than I am. And I'm going to send an email later today to David Bryan Davis, the great historian at Yale University, for whom I was taking his American Intellectual, Cultural, and History class in 1984 and wrote a paper on the legend of Sleepy Hollow, and have always loved the story and thought that it was the best thing I'd ever done, actually, that paper, that little undergrad paper. And so when I saw the opportunity to speak about this at American University, I just jumped right on it. And then when this invitation came, I didn't hesitate even a moment to accept the invitation. I should explain a little bit more context. What is this lawyer guy doing talking about the legend of Sleepy Hollow? I have a PhD in American history as well as a law degree. And in addition to that, I focus on intellectual and cultural history as well as legal history, as reflected in the title of my new book. And finally, I should say that my worlds intersect a little bit with this talk, because you'll see that I talk a fair amount about food in this talk, because Washington Irving's story is infused with images of food. And I'll even, for purposes of the law librarians here and lawyers, I will also even make a gesture toward law and literature and talk about Washington Irving's vision of law in this piece. And you may think, what? Vision of law in The Legend of Sleepy Hollow? It's there. Now let me just ask, how many of you have ever read The Legend of Sleepy Hollow? How many of you have read it recently Okay, so, yeah, so I will do some pretty close textual analysis, but it's helpful for me to know how familiar the audience is with the story. This is a great new function, by the way, on the web called Prezi, which you can do the equivalent of PowerPoints on. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow is installment 6 of Washington Irving's sketchbook, written under the pseudonym Geoffrey Crayon, gentleman. Let me give you a little bit of background on Washington Irving. There's a picture of him as a young man, some 27 years old, and this is the year before his death. Looks like he hardly aged at all, although his nose seems to have changed. I haven't exactly figured that out. So Washington Irving was born on April 3rd, 1783 in New York City, about 5 months before the signing of the Treaty of Paris, ending the Revolutionary War. He was named after George Washington by his Federalist parents. He was the youngest of 11 children of a middle-class merchant with a family import business. One of my favorite stories about Washington Irving is that in 1789, he was walking, when he was 6 years old, he was walking down the streets of New York City, which of course were at that time contained completely below Bleecker Street. And he was walking with his nurse, and they ran into none other than the new president of the United States, George Washington, his namesake, who blessed him. So he was blessed by George Washington. He was a rambunctious and restless child, and always of somewhat poor health, and his parents were always very worried about that. And one of the great health issues of the time was yellow fever epidemics, which hit major U.S. cities sequentially. And there was a major yellow fever epidemic in 1798. Here's a map of the yellow fever cases in that epidemic. And Washington Irving's parents and his older siblings were worried enough about him that they sent him out of town to live outside the epidemic. And where did they send him but to Tarrytown, New York, up the Hudson River. He stayed with a friend in Tarrytown, New York, and at this point, remember, he's around 15 years old, and he wandered around the environs with his family friend with whom he's staying, and encountered the small village of Sleepy Hollow, near Tarrytown. And the old Dutch church, erected in 1685 in Sleepy Hollow, still exists. This graveyard is where the Headless Horseman is buried, although that's just a legend. We're not sure if that's actually true. So he continued his growth. And I want to mention by the way, about Sleepy Hollow. I want to say that Sleepy Hollow's population was made up largely of the descendants of the original Dutch settlers of New York. And apparently, Washington Irving was very mesmerized by the place and took additional trips there as a youth. He always had the desire to go into the world of literature, but he also felt this competing pull to go into law, which was the respectable profession that was most obvious to him. Two of his brothers were graduates of Columbia Law School. And the pull was irresistible, and in 1789, he started work at a law office. In 1801, he transferred to the law office of Henry Brockholst Livingston, which some of you may have heard of, whom some of you may have heard of. He's the author of the dissenting opinion in Pearson v. Post, the famous fox hunting case, and later an associate justice of the United States Supreme Court. So after working with Livingston, he then clerked and read law with this man on the screen, Josiah Ogden Hoffman, a prominent Federalist lawyer who had been the Attorney General of New York State. So he started reading law with Hoffman, but then he took ill again, and he was sent off to Europe, the idea being it would be good for his health. And indeed, he got better on the ship, and between 1804 and 1806, he traveled around Europe, not taking the conventional grand tour of Europe, but a rather unconventional path through the continent, through Spain and France and Italy. At one point, his ship was taken by Italian pirates, and he also became very, very worldly and sociable through this trip. So he came back in 1806 and felt the pull of law again, or the force of law maybe from the direction of his family. And so he went to study and read again with Judge Hoffman. And in 1806, he was admitted to the bar. Apparently, he did terribly in his bar exam. Everyone acknowledges that he was admitted to the bar, quote, more through courtesy than desert. Washington Irving hated the law. He complained in letters about, quote, this wrangling, driving, unmerciful profession. He saw the legal profession as both spiritually and practically diametrically opposed to his preferred life as a writer. And he hated the pedanticism of lawyers. He hated the books. He hated everything about law. So you might have thought, okay, off he goes, never to see law again. But there was a certain attraction to staying in law. And there she is, Sarah Matilda Hoffman, the daughter of Judge Hoffman. This is Washington Irving's Katrina Van Tassel. Judge Hoffman, offered Washington Irving Matilda's hand and a full partnership in his law practice. So this is what he put before him. But a condition of this deal was that Washington Irving had to prove himself as a capable attorney. And it's interesting to think about how the portrayal of romance in A Legend of Sleepy Hollow is probably colored by this relationship, because as I'll talk about more, for Ichabod Crane, the attraction of Katrina is all about acquisition of wealth and status. There's no love. Washington Irving was certainly consumed by love for Matilda Hoffman, but at the same time, his draw toward her was clearly mixed in with this offer by Judge Hoffman for a life of comfort and wealth as a lawyer. So Washington Irving, he was totally in love, but he was also miserable about this bargain that he was offered by Hoffman. He said, quote, "I could study anything else rather than law, and I had a fatal propensity to I can never say that well, bell letters." In 1809, the conundrum that he is facing is resolved in the most tragic, romantic way. Matilda dies suddenly of consumption. Washington Irving never picks up a law book again, and he lives his life, he lives his life out as a bachelor. So while he was battling with himself about whether to pursue law or literature, he'd been working on a book that became his first very well-known book, A History of New York, published in 1809. A History of New York is a satirical history of New York in the Dutch period. It was written under a pseudonym, Dietrich Knickerbocker, a Dutch historian invented by Washington Irving. And this was a wildly popular book. And of course, the name Knickerbocker ends up becoming part of New York culture and lore and legend, even to the point of the basketball team, the Knicks, being ultimately owing their name to Washington Irving, who also, by the way, invented the term Gotham for New York City. So in 1809, he writes this book, and he sees a path ahead as a life as an author. But business calls again. His family's merchant business is having a lot of financial difficulty, so his brothers send him to Europe to try to save the business. And so off he goes to Europe again. The War of 1812 had taken place. It was a total disaster for the Irving family trading company. So Washington Irving goes and stays in Europe until 1832. While in Europe, he travels to Scotland and for the first time encounters this gentleman, Sir Walter Scott, the author of Ivanhoe and Rob Roy and other wildly popular books of the time. Like Washington Irving, Walter Scott was, first of all, the most popular author in his land. Second of all, a representative of the prevailing romantic movement in literature. And third, a lawyer who had chosen to abandon the law and pursue romantic literature. So he became Sir Walter Scott's dear friend, and Walter Scott remained a lifelong friend and influence on Washington Irving. So while Washington Irving is speaking with Sir Walter Scott introduces him to German and Scottish folklore and legend. Sir Walter Scott was fascinated by oral tradition and folklore, and he urged Washington Irving to become familiar with these traditions. And amongst the traditions Washington Irving becomes familiar with are the legends in both German and Scottish folklore and legend of headless horsemen. And so, first of all, there are a couple of German folk legends later published by the Grimm brothers concerning headless horsemen. And in addition, in Scotland, there was a legend of Ewan the Headless. This on the right is Ewan the Headless. If you look carefully, you can see that he's actually wearing tartan. He is a headless clan. When you say clansman, I don't mean clansman. I mean like Scottish clansman, who supposedly haunted Scotland. And so this obviously had a lot of influence on Washington Irving going forward. The business goes under. Washington Irving says, I'm going to stay in Europe and dedicate my life to a life of literature. And his production, first major production, written in Europe is called the Sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon. This is a collection of 34 essays and short stories that Irving wrote under the pseudonym Geoffrey Crayon. The pieces were mostly about England and set in England, not in America. They weren't only fiction, there were a lot of nonfiction essays in the tradition of Addison and Steele. But the two most famous pieces in the sketchbook are the two most atypical, in certain ways, stories in the sketchbook. They are Rip Van Winkle, which was published in the first installment in 1819, and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, which appeared in the sixth installment in 1820. Interestingly, these two stories within the sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon were written under the Knickerbocker pseudonym. So the fake Geoffrey Crayon says that he found these stories in the papers of the late Diedrich Knickerbocker when Diedrich Knickerbocker passed away. The sketchbook became a huge sensation, both in the United States and in Britain, due largely to these two stories. Some scholars identify these stories as the progenitors of the American short story form. So here's where I introduce you to some of my independent research on Google's n-gram function. Are you guys familiar with the n-gram function? On some day when you don't have much to do, take a look at it because it is addictive. The Google n-gram function analyzes the frequency with which words are used as a total percentage, as a percentage of the total number of words appearing in the books published in that year. So in other words, it's a measure not of absolute number of times a word is used, but the number of times a word is used as a relative matter over time. And you can search American, you can search British literature, and it's great fun. You can enter Spider-Man, Batman, and Superman and look at their rises and falls in American culture. So I use this function to examine just how popular Washington Irving was in England, because it's often said that he was extremely popular in England. And so I compared Charles Dickens to Washington Irving. And with both of these men, you can't simply enter their name, you have to enter their pseudonyms as well. And so I have, the blue line is Charles Dickens and Boz. Boz was Dickens' pseudonym. The red line is Washington Irving and Geoffrey Crayon and Diedrich Knickerbocker. And as you can see, Washington Irving was actually more popular than Charles Dickens until about 1865, or mentioned more frequently at least. And 1865 was after Charles Dickens had already published every single one of his books that you're aware of except for Edwin Drood. So Washington Irving truly was a very popular figure in England. I compared him to a bunch of other people that, the only one who was clearly more popular was Sir Walter Scott himself. He was respected by the European intelligentsia. He was a celebrity in the salons of Paris and London. None less than Thackeray referred to Irving as, quote, the ambassador whom the new world of letters sent to the old. So Washington Irving truly was the first American man of letters accepted by Europe. So, of course, an interesting question about the legend of Sleepy Hollow is its persistence in the American imagination. So I wanted to figure out just how popular this story is over time. And so the Library of Congress put together a list of the 88 books that changed America. And I wanted to compare the frequency with which Ichabod Crane is mentioned compared to leading male characters in other books in the 88 books that changed America. And he does quite well, thank you. So the blue line that starts the earliest, and as you can see, cuts a path, steady path right, it was number one for a very long time, and then as the other characters started to emerge, it's steady blue line right through the right side of the graph there. That is Ichabod Crane. Give you a sense of who the other characters, in case you can't read them, are that I'm comparing him to. He is a little bit less popular today, although that may have changed since the Fox series started. This only goes till 2000. A little bit less popular than Ahab, Rhett Butler, Holden Caulfield, but mentioned more frequently in 2000 than Jay Gatsby, Atticus Finch, Simon Legree, and Stanley Kowalski. So he's doing very well for himself as recently as 2000. I was also interested in the persistence in the American imagination of the Headless Horseman. So I wanted to figure out who are the most popular ghosts in the American imagination. This one was fun. So here are America's favorite ghosts. The Headless Horseman is the one that ends up in first place on the very right of the screen. So as of 2000, he was the most popular ghost in American books, at least. And you can tell that he's had a good long run. He's never really faded. Just in case you're curious, the ghosts that he's beating handily by 2000 include Jacob Marley from A Christmas Carol, Banquo's ghost, Shakespeare's Banquo's ghost, Miss Jessel from Turn of the Screw, who makes a really good run in the early 1960s because of the movie The Innocents starring Deborah Kerr. So you can see that this really is reflecting cultural trends. And so I can imagine with the Fox series now, you would see, if the Google database went to the present, you'd see a soaring slope for the Headless Horseman. He also handily, very easily beats Casper the Friendly Ghost, who is the second to last one on the bottom. And he destroys Freddy Krueger from Nightmare on Elm Street, who just never really makes more than a blip in the American literature. And indeed, the legend of Sleepy Hollow has a very persistent presence in American popular culture and literature. You can walk over to the Smithsonian American Art Museum, just a few blocks from here, and see this painting, which I love, by John Quidor, the illustrator of early American literature. He also, for example, he did a better. This is okay. He was an illustrator of American literature, including, for example, Last of the Mohicans, and this is his painting hanging today of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Made an early presence in visual or movie media. There was a movie called The Headless Horseman starring Will Rogers in 1922. I can't say that I have seen it. It is apparently quite loyal or faithful to the text. The popular version that probably inserted itself into the brains of more Americans than any other is Disney's 1949 version of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. How many of you have seen Disney's Legend of Sleepy Hollow? So it is narrated by Bing Crosby with a couple of songs about Katrina and about Ichabod. And it's actually wonderful and much more faithful to the text than any of the subsequent versions that I'll mention in a moment. It actually captures, in some ways, the spirit of Washington Irving better than the more recent iterations. And so I think this is the vision of the Headless Horseman that was inserted into the brains of American children for an entire generation. When I was a little kid, I was a stamp collector, and this was my favorite stamp. I think it's just beautiful. Washington Irving's Legend of Sleepy Hollow. And so it made the US Postal Service. And then comes this dreadful version of the Legend of Sleepy Hollow, which I watched just a few weeks ago, Tim Burton's Legend of Sleepy Hollow, a movie in 1999. In this version, Ichabod Crane is a late 18th century New York City detective sent to Sleepy Hollow to try to solve a spate of beheadings, murders, using modern crime-solving techniques. So they turn Ichabod Crane bizarrely into a scientistic New York City detective. Don't know why. So I recommend that you not waste time on that movie if you haven't seen already. And then, of course, we get to the modern TV series. How many of you have watched any episodes of this? It is only the left side of the room. What is that? It is actually one of the big hits of this TV season, running against Monday Night Football, yet it has incredibly high ratings. It has almost nothing to do with The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, except for the names of the characters and the name of the town, Sleepy Hollow. Ichabod Crane is an Oxford professor who immigrated to the United States, so that archetypal Yankee Ichabod Crane is turned into an Oxford professor. And in the series, Ichabod Crane, the Englishman, was fighting in the American Revolution on the side of the Americans and beheaded the Hessian, who became the Headless Horseman. And then he is transported, Ichabod Crane, to the present, where he joins forces with a Sleepy Hollow police officer in a town that is identified as having like 180,000 people in it. So it says Sleepy Hollow, 180,000. In a town, as I said to the Washington Post yesterday, that seems more like Yonkers than Sleepy Hollow. And he does battle against the Headless Horseman in modern day Sleepy Hollow / Yonkers. And the Headless Horseman is one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse from the book of Revelations. So it has this whole religious thing going, which is completely foreign to Washington Irving's version. So nonetheless, it reflects the fact that the Sleepy Hollow maintains some kind of hold on the American imagination. And I think it's worth considering what it is about the book that maintains that hold. I want to now turn to the text itself and talk about, and I don't have any other illustrations, I'm sad to say, so let's just, to stay in the mood, let's go back to the stamp. How about that? There we go. Okay. So now, just remember this vision while I talk to you about the book. First of all, I want to talk about what the book says, or the tale says, about Washington Irving's vision of the United States of his time versus Europe. The whole tale, which remember Washington Irving wrote in England, is infused with Irving's critical contemplations on the distinctions between the old world and the new. So Sleepy Hollow is inhabited by the Dutch community. There's constant references to their Dutch origins and to their old world customs. Irving portrays a placid and completely insular community. Very similar to the way that de Tocqueville describes certain towns he encountered in remote corners of the old world. He said, Tocqueville, "In certain remote corners of the old world, you may still sometimes stumble upon a small district which seems to have been forgotten amid the general tumult and to have remained stationary while everything around it was in motion." Well, that is Sleepy Hollow. It is a sanctuary which has remained stationary while everything around it is in motion. So there's something very European about it, Sleepy Hollow. Every single character has van in front of their name. Their customs, their houses, their clothes all harken back to the old world. Now let's contrast that with the intruder into Sleepy Hollow, Ichabod Crane. Ichabod is a native of Connecticut, the most Yankee of states. And indeed, I think Legend of Sleepy Hollow can be seen in certain ways as a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court parallel. Ichabod Crane is unambiguously Anglo-Saxon, apparently the only soul in the village without a van in front of his name. In a society of simple farmers, he is the only one who performs the quote-unquote labor of headwork for a living. And after he leaves Sleepy Hollow, he leads a life almost stereotypically characteristic of a 19th century American. The author reports that he changed his quarters to a distant part of the country. He had studied law, had been admitted to the bar, turned politician, electioneered and written for the newspapers, and finally had been made a justice of the 10-pound court in New York City. So that is, for those of you who don't believe that Ichabod Crane was spirited away by the Headless Horseman, some people report that that's what happened to Ichabod Crane. The majority of the population of Sleepy Hollow rejects this story and thinks that he was actually spirited away by the Headless Horseman. So the story is a study in contrast between mobility and stability, between New World mobility and Old World stability. And therefore, the Legend of Sleepy Hollow is an implicit criticism of the restless, rootless ambition of 19th century Americans. So Irving describes Sleepy Hollow as a valley whose, quote, population's manners and customs remain fixed, while the great torrent of migration and improvement, which is making such incessant change in other parts of this restless country, sweeps by them unobserved. Very similar to Tocqueville's description of an isolated European village. And it's clear that Washington Irving likes this aspect of Sleepy Hollow. The narrator mentions Sleepy Hollow and these characteristics, quote, with all possible laud, L-A-U-D. He loves it. The narrator of the story says, though many years have elapsed since I trod the drowsy shades of Sleepy Hollow, yet I question whether I should not still find the same trees and the same families vegetating in its sheltered bosom. Complete stability. And he also notes that local tales and superstitions thrive best in these sheltered, long-settled retreats, but they are trampled underfoot by the shifting throng that forms the population of most of our places. So this is very much a tale of its place, its imaginary place, Sleepy Hollow. Now contrast that vision of stability to Ichabod Crane himself. Whereas Sleepy Hollow slumbers unchanging through the passage of time, Ichabod stands for the shifting, unsettled quality of 19th century American society. He is repeatedly described as an itinerant bachelor. He lives with a different family each week. He carries all of his worldly possessions in a bundle made from a handkerchief. He makes the point of saying that he does not sojourn in Sleepy Hollow, but tarries there, suggesting that he's going to be up and off somewhere else before long. When he dances, quote, not a limb, not a fiber about him is idle. He is all motion, all action, a fidgety presence in this drowsy community. He thus symbolizes the excessive restlessness of the American people in general. Indeed, Ichabod's restlessness threatens to subvert the familial and communal order of Sleepy Hollow itself. Washington Irving describes Ichabod Crane as such. He says, his busy fancy already, this is when he sees Katrina for the first time, his busy fancy already realized his hopes and presented to him the blooming Katrina with a whole family of children mounted on top of a wagon, setting out for Kentucky, Tennessee, or the Lord knows where. So much for families vegetating in the same place for years. Ichabod Crane presents a direct threat to that. And this is also echoed in Tocqueville. Tocqueville notes, quote, in the United States, a man builds a house to spend his latter years in it, and he sells it before the roof is on. He plants a garden and lets it just as the trees are coming into bearing. He settles in a place which he soon afterward leaves to carry his changeable longings elsewhere. So I think that Washington Irving and Tocqueville were sensing the same characteristic in the American character of that time. And of course, another very important aspect of that character is the pursuit of wealth, the greedy pursuit of wealth. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow is also a criticism of the dominance of the capitalist ethos in antebellum America. The way that Washington Irving structures the story, Sleepy Hollow is actually at a two-layer remove from market capitalism. At the center of market capitalism, of course, is New York City itself, always present in the background of any Washington Irving story about the Hudson area. Then there's Tarrytown. Tarrytown is described as a small market town where some tarrying is done. Sleepy Hollow is outside of Tarrytown. And so you see this diminishment of market forces as you go from New York City to Tarrytown to Sleepy Hollow. And he describes the economy of Sleepy Hollow in a very sort of pre-capitalist way. The Dutch New Yorkers are merged as a community with the land which fosters them, the same land originally settled by their immigrant ancestors. To them, land is not a mere commodity. It's the basis for communal stability and generational continuity. Listen to Irving's description of old Baltus Van Tassel, Katrina's father. He seldom, it is true, sent either his eyes or his thoughts beyond the boundaries of his own farm. But within those, everything was snug, happy, and well-conditioned. He was satisfied with his wealth, but not proud of it. In contrast to this, Ichabod is a greedy Yankee capitalist. He is a land speculator to be, who views land as simply a commodity. Washington Irving describes Ichabod as follows. His heart yearned after the damsel, Katrina, who was to inherit these domains, and his imagination expanded with the idea of how they might be readily turned into cash and the money invested in immense tracts of wild land. This acquisitive, venturesome, and outward-looking posture contrasts sharply with the Dutch characters. And Ichabod's drive for material success threatens not only his soul, but also the stability of the entire community, as I mentioned before when I talked about him carting Katrina off to Lord knows where. So this is where food comes into it. And I'm a food and drug specialist, so I guess that I am interested in food more than I know. So the food imagery in the Legend of Sleepy Hollow is fascinating. The difference between the way that Ichabod and the Dutch villagers consider the abundance of food around them corresponds to the contrast between the New World and Old World spirit. So start with the Dutch. The Dutch are never actually described consuming or even thinking about the copious comestibles all around them. That's an Irving turn of phrase, copious comestibles. They are, however, obviously well-nourished. He describes them as buxom lasses, Herculean brombones, plump Katrina, round and jolly old Van Tassel. Van Tassel was, quote, a perfect picture of a thriving, contented, liberal-hearted farmer. The Dutch New York society represents satisfaction without rapacity. Again, contrast this to Ichabod Crane. Ichabod in the story is frequently pictured contemplating, possessing, and consuming the delicious bounty around him. Almost everything in Sleepy Hollow appears to him as something he can eat. The autumnal scene of Van Tassel's fields and orchards, a delightful picture of pastoral magnificence, melts in his vision into visions of sumptuous meals. His quote-unquote devouring mind's eye is, quote, ever open to every symptom of culinary abundance. He is, quote, the genius of famine descending upon the earth. And his appetite for food parallels his appetite for wealth. Irving says, Ichabod could not help rolling his large eyes around him as he ate. So he's sitting around and chuckling with the possibility that he might one day be lord of all this scene of almost unimaginable luxury and splendor. Yet, despite the fact he's constantly shown eating, unlike the townfolk, Ichabod, as you know, is exceedingly scrawny. That's part of his archetype. Irving says, quote, he was a huge feeder, and though lank, had the dilating powers of an anaconda. No amount of food will satisfy Ichabod. He appears permanently malnourished, even in the midst of plenitude. He thus stands for the insatiable order, the new insatiable order in America. And I like to think of the pumpkin at the end of the story as actually being laden with significance that it's not often given, because we don't eat pumpkin that much these days. We do around this time of year, obviously. But the pumpkin appears earlier in the story as food on a couple of occasions. So when he sees the yellow pumpkins turning up their fair round bellies to the sun in the field, his mind turns immediately to the most luxurious of pies. So the pumpkin also appears on the Dutch table at the big party at Van Tassel's mansion. And so the shattered pumpkin lying on the ground at the end of the story, to me, seems somewhat of a symbol of Ichabod's thwarted gluttony in general. The anxious spirit of gain described by Washington Irving, he suggests is not healthy for the soul. In this story, Ichabod's ravenous quest for a huge meal merges with his compulsion to get rich, and both cause him much restless unease. So Irving says, quote, from the moment Ichabod laid his eyes upon these regions of delight, the peace of his mind was at an end, and his only study was how to gain the affections of the peerless daughter of Van Tassel. Contrast that with Van Tassel's quiet contentedness with his circumstances. And again, Tocqueville has something to say about the American character at this time, which parallels Irving's observation. Tocqueville, in his great work, asserts that the United States has the happiest circumstances which the world affords. But it is strange to see with what feverish ardor the Americans pursue their own welfare, and to watch the vague dread that constantly torments them, lest they should not have chosen the shortest path which may lead to it. A native of the United States is hasty in grasping at all within his reach. At first sight, there is something surprising in this strange unrest of so many happy men, restless in the midst of abundance. That is Ichabod Crane, restlessness in the midst of abundance. Another theme that I've noticed in this story is a curious anti-intellectualism on Irving's part. He manifests a curious and striking ambivalence about book learning and school, a mocking rejection of intellectual pretension. Ichabod is described as inferior in learning only to the parson in Sleepy Hollow. But does Washington Irving really respect this? Well, he also says that Ichabod Crane was esteemed by the women as a man of great erudition, for he had read several books quite through. He describes Connecticut as, quote, a state which supplies the Union with pioneers for the mind as well as for the forest. He does not favor the pioneers of the mind, and it's fairly obvious as you read the story. What's the Dutch view of such things? And of course, Ichabod Crane is a schoolmaster, and Irving describes the, quote, appalling sound of the birch as he urged some tardy loiterer along the flowery path of knowledge. The Dutch men, at least, the women like Ichabod, the Dutch men, at least, are apt to consider the cost of schooling a grievous burden and schoolmasters as mere drones. After Crane is expelled from the town by the Headless Horseman, Hans von Ripper, who was his landlord, determined to send his children no more to school, observing that he never knew any good come of this same reading and writing. After Ichabod leaves, they consign his books to the flames. There is a book burning at the end of Sleepy Hollow, not a big scene. And in fact, Nancy Davenport at American spoke this week in the next in the series on Fahrenheit 451. And I said to her, what does Fahrenheit 451 have in common with the Legend of Sleepy Hollow? And it's book burning. The Dutch consigned Ichabod's books to the flames. The schoolhouse is deserted and falls into decay, and Ichabod, the entire symbol of intellectualism or false intellectualism that he presented, disappears. So I'd like to talk about Washington Irving's vision of the role of storytelling. Irving suggests that the traditional oral culture of the Dutch is superior to the Yankee book-based intellectualism that I was just describing. And it's superior artistically, but it's also superior in serving an important function, which is resisting the negative influences of modernity. The mobile and individualistic Yankee Ichabod Crane carries on his solitary wanderings Cotton Mather's History of Witchcraft, a pretend book, but it's a pretend book of individual scholarship from Puritan New England. Ichabod Crane thus typifies a literary order that individualistically reads and writes books rather than shares tales. He represents a breakdown of the collective folk imagination. By contrast, the Dutch in this story have a thriving oral culture. Irving notes ruefully the following: local tales and superstitions thrive best in these sheltered, long-settled retreats, Sleepy Hollow, but are trampled underfoot by the shifting throng that forms the population of most of our country places. This is the line I like. Besides, there's no encouragement for ghosts in most of our villages, for they have scarcely had time to finish their first nap before their surviving friends have traveled away from the neighborhood, so that when they turn out at night to walk their rounds, they have no acquaintance left to call upon. What does Irving see as oral culture's unique value? Well, Sleepy Hollow's timeless order is threatened by historical intrusions. It's threatened by the American Revolution. And then it's threatened by Ichabod Crane's arrival. What ultimately saves Sleepy Hollow's timeless existence is its collective folk imagination. In the Legend of Sleepy Hollow, tale-telling is a method for resisting historical intrusions into the village's unchanging natural rhythms. The Dutch residents spin legends and superstitions around historical intrusions into Sleepy Hollow. Thus, Major Andre, a British spy during the Revolution, who was, in fact, by the way, captured in Tarrytown or around Tarrytown, Major Andre is thus said to haunt the tree where he was captured. So they turn Major Andre into a ghost. Likewise, a decapitated Hessian trooper becomes the specter of the Headless Horseman. In this way, historical intrusions become part of the village's sleepy, timeless, enchanted experience, as opposed to historical facts. The Sleepy Hollow residents do the same thing in the story to the memory of Ichabod Crane's disruptive presence. They spin a web of fiction around it in the story. So literally, Ichabod Crane is chased out of the community by the local folklore in the sense that he flees what he perceives to be the Headless Horseman, the favorite specter of Sleepy Hollow. On another level, he is evicted from Sleepy Hollow by being absorbed as a legend into the folk imagination itself. Ichabod Crane, by the end of the book, becomes a frightening but harmless apparition. The old country wives talk of how he was spirited away by supernatural means. His psalm-singing voice haunts the old schoolhouse and spooks boys walking alone at night in Sleepy Hollow. Ichabod becomes just another neighborhood ghost, along with Major Andre and the Headless Horseman. But now I want to talk about storytelling at another level. I want to talk about, and this may start to touch on why The Legend of Sleepy Hollow is such a timeless tale in the American imagination. Irving turns The Legend of Sleepy Hollow itself, a product of his pen in England, written at a particular time, he turns it into an oral tale with deep roots from an undetermined past. Look what he does. So the book was written by Washington Irving in 1820, less than 40 years after the end of the Revolutionary War. But the story appears in the sketchbook, written under a pseudonym, Geoffrey Crayon. But this particular story was found among the papers of the late Diedrich Knickerbocker. So now think of all these layers of remove from Washington Irving. In a postscript to the story, Diedrich Knickerbocker says he relates the story, quote, in almost the precise words in which he heard it related at a New York City meeting by, quote, a pleasant, shabby, gentlemanly old fellow. So this person related it orally to Diedrich Knickerbocker, who of course doesn't actually exist. So when you're reading the book, the source of the narrator's voice is unclear. Who's talking? Is it Knickerbocker? Is it this old fellow? Who knows? But whichever of them is talking is relating a tale of a remote period of American history. That is to say, some 30 years since. 30 years. 30 years before when? Before 1820, when Irving wrote the story? Before the date that Knickerbocker wrote his narrative? Before the date that the old fellow orally reported the narrative to the New York corporation? It's completely unclear. All we know is that Ichabod arrives in town sometime after the American Revolution. Meanwhile, this narrator, whoever he is, in turn relates within the story of Sleepy Hollow numerous oral tales shared amongst the townfolk of Sleepy Hollow. The end result is an artificially created, deep-rooted American folklore or fairy tale. And that's how the story lives today. He created in his literary imagination a folkloric tradition that, of course, did not exist in reality. But it worked. It worked because Ichabod Crane and the Headless Horseman are now our fairy tales. In 1905, a commentator noted that Washington Irving's sketchbook, quote, has made his name as much a household word here as Grimm's name is in Germany. That became Washington Irving's legacy to American literature in certain respects, creating out of whole cloth a deep-rooted folkloric tradition. It's interesting also to see other ways that Irving tries to reach back into an imagined past. Another way is his repeated allusions to chivalry and knighthood in the book, but chivalry and knighthood with an American spin. Obviously, he was inspired here, at least somewhat, by the author of Ivanhoe, Sir Walter Scott. Ichabod, the word knight errant of yore, the phrase, appears 3 different times in the book. Ichabod is explicitly distinguished from the knight errant of yore at one point. Another time, he's compared to a knight errant of yore, but this is in jest. Because listen to what Irving then says in an image perhaps borrowed from Don Quixote. He says, "But it is meet I should, in the true spirit of romantic story, give some account of the looks and equipments of my hero and his steed. The animal he bestrode was a broken-down plow horse that had outlived almost everything but its viciousness. Ichabod was a suitable figure for such a steed. He rode with short stirrups, which brought his knees nearly up to the pommel of the saddle. His sharp elbows stuck out like a grasshopper's. He carried his whip perpendicularly in his hand like a scepter, and as his horse jogged on, the motion of his arms was not unlike the flapping of a pair of wings." So this is not true chivalry, not true knighthood, but an Americanized and perhaps Don Quixote-ized vision of it. Brom Bones, by contrast, is described as having a rough chivalry to him. And he would, quote, "fain have settled their pretensions to Katrina according to the mode of knights errant of yore, by single combat." So Brom Bones is the true romantic hero in a sense, but Ichabod makes a Ivanhoe-like confrontation impossible. Because Ichabod recognized that to have taken the field openly against his rival would have been madness. Ichabod therefore made his advances in a quiet and gently insinuating manner. So Ichabod's approach leaves Brom with no alternative but to draw upon the funds of rustic waggery. And so Brom Bones truly becomes an Americanized knight who uses rustic tactics in order to achieve his goals. I want to close and leave a little bit of time for discussion by since this is the Law Library of Congress, I want to talk about law and lawyers in The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. I think it is significant that Ichabod becomes a lawyer and a judge after he leaves Sleepy Hollow. Indeed, he's presented as a legal figure various ways throughout the story, and in an almost uniformly negative way. First, take Cotton Mather. Cotton Mather, any reader would have recognized, was the force behind the Salem witch trials. That was really his legacy to America. And yet, Ichabod is described as a perfect master of Cotton Mather's history of New England witchcraft, in which, by the way, he most firmly and potently believed. Second, he's often described as a figure of justice within his schoolhouse in a negative way. So Washington Irving describes Ichabod Crane in the schoolhouse like this. He says, "He administered justice with discrimination rather than severity, taking the burden off the backs of the weak and laying it on those of the strong. Your mere puny sapling was passed by with indulgence, but the claims of justice were satisfied by inflicting a double portion on some little tough Dutch urchin." Now that is not fair justice, is it? In his hand he swayed a ferule, which is an old word for a ruler, that scepter of despotic power. The birch of justice reposed on 3 nails behind the throne, a constant terror to evildoers. He's described as the flogger of urchins. And this man, after leaving Sleepy Hollow, becomes a lawyer and a judge, which I think reflects to some degree on Washington Irving's vision of the legal profession and American law in general. Brom Bones, by contrast, is an attractive sort of judicial figure. Washington Irving says, "With the ascendancy which bodily strength always acquires in rustic life, he was the umpire in all disputes, setting his hat on one side and giving his decisions with an air and tone admitting of no gainsay or appeal. And based on this function and role, the neighbors looked upon him with a mixture of awe, admiration, and goodwill." So I haven't really figured out exactly what the role of law is in The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. But once I learned about Washington Irving's biography, about his relationship to law, I think that the references to law and lawyers are not accidental. One final thought I want to leave you with is a curious parallelism within the story that I can't figure out at all between Ichabod Crane on the one hand and the African American characters on the other hand. You probably don't think of there being African American characters in Ichabod, in The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, but they are there. And by the way, they were also in the Hudson Valley as slaves for a long time. The African American characters in the book are the characters who are most like Ichabod Crane himself. So there's a black messenger who brings the invitation to the Van Tassel party. And Washington Irving uses very similar language in describing him that he uses to describe Ichabod Crane. He says that he assumed an air of importance and made a, quote, effort at fine language, and that he hurried away the same way Ichabod Crane was always in a hurry. There's also a black musician at the party who had, quote, been the itinerant orchestra in the neighborhood. So he's the other one in the story who's described as an itinerant. And when Ichabod is dancing in what today is certainly a racist image, Washington Irving describes the African Americans in the neighborhood gazing with delight at the scene. So I haven't quite figured that out, and I'd be interested in any impressions you might have about that, those of you who have read the book recently. The other thing I can't exactly figure out is the importance of psalmody, Psalmody, in the book. He is a psalm master at the church, and it is mentioned again and again and again. Now, Washington Irving rejected his father's ultra-devout Presbyterianism and embraced a much more casual Anglicanism. And there does seem to be some sort of subtle anti-clerical strain running through the story. A criticism of Cotton Mather's religious extremism, but also a criticism of Ichabod's false piety. Ichabod's role as an instructor of psalmody is presented mainly as a path to a few shillings and to an opportunity to woo Katrina. It's completely a path to riches, basically, for him. And one of the last sounds we're left with in the entire story is the ghostly sound of Ichabod Crane singing psalms. And I haven't quite figured out what's going on there. So with those thoughts, I'd like to just sort of ask your impressions of various questions. Those of you who have read the book recently, those of you who haven't. And one of the things I really want to hear your reactions to is, why do you think The Legend of Sleepy Hollow is still so deeply woven into our national consciousness 2 centuries after it was written? Thanks for listening. Any thoughts on that? Pull back from the words of the book and just think about the images. And what do you think it is? Like, what about it do you think led the drafters of the 88 books that changed America to include this little tale that nobody views as, great literature in the traditional sense? Why did they include that on the list? Any thoughts? You're at the Library of Congress. I thought you're supposed to know the answer.
I suppose there's like elements of fear and bravery in the struggle of that.
And what is it? Of course, elements of fear and bravery are common in fiction. What do you think it is about their embodiment in this story that makes this such an enduring?
It's just a human thing that we all deal with.
Other thoughts? Yeah.
Legend is inherently fascinating, maybe for an unexplainable reason, like Iago. I also think it's beautifully written.
It really is.
I read it probably about 2 years ago, and it just grabs you. I mean, the description of the environment, it draws you along. It's just really, the rhythm to it. I found myself reading it out loud.
Yeah.
Because it's almost full.
Although, of course, most of the people who saw and reacted to this stamp had never, or had not necessarily at least, read the book itself. So I agree that it endures as a beautifully, beautifully written work. There's no doubt about that.
My answer was two different.
Yeah.
Two different questions.
Yeah. Yes.
I guess when I reread it, my reaction was actually the opposite. Why has this had such, a duration in American cultural history and literature and news? Because as you explained in your lecture, I mean, Ichabod Crane isn't the most sympathetic character.
Not at
I
all.
don't remember that as whenever I read it as a child or as a teenager or whenever I was assigned to read it, a long time ago, and seeing all the different iterations of it, I kind of view Ichabod Crane, at least I view him as, this bad thing happens to him and it's kind of sad. When I reread the Irving, he's a very flawed character, and that's kind of interesting because in U.S. culture we kind of look for the hero, and he's very
Flawed enough to flip over into anti-hero, do you think?
Yeah, I don't know about that. I mean, I wouldn't hold him. He's
Oh.
just a very mixed bag.
Yeah, almost though.
Yeah, almost.
There's very little appealing about him.
I agree. Yeah.
Very little appealing. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would go back, sorry, to Iago again. Sympathetic characters aren't interesting. Bad guys are not.
Right. Right. Although what's interesting about this is that normally a story has a protagonist.
Yeah.
It's unclear who the protagonist of this story is, except for Sleepy Hollow. The village of Sleepy Hollow itself is probably the protagonist, right? Yeah.
The preponderance lately of any movies and TV shows about and books about the supernatural seem to be prevalent. Sleepy Hollow is just the show, it's just the latest, but zombies, the Twilight, all of that, undead. I mean, it just could be an escapism, especially after 9/11. But I don't know. There's a lot of other literature that escapism and others, but.
It was interesting to me when I was doing that Ngram search. It was interesting how hard it was to think of as ghosts in the American canon, right? So I thought of Turn of the Screw, I thought of this, but there's very little else. But nonetheless, of course, there's always been, maybe below the level of the canon, a real fascination with the haunted and ghosts and the supernatural. Yeah.
I think going back to the question a little bit of why it's lasted is because it gives, American literature kind of a sense of ancientness. The British have their Beowulf, and then there's Gilgamesh, and you've got King Arthur, and America's a blip compared to that kind of heavy history. So a story like this, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, like you said, Geoffrey Crayon got it from Knickerbocker, who got it from Unknown Man, who told it to him, gives it that heaviness of history, makes it seem like it's a lot more ancient than really it could possibly be. But we have these stories in our history, it's great.
Yes.
I think we continue to hold on to the concept of storytelling. And it is a really excellent example of storytelling as a form of expression. And we see it now recurring, like capturing oral histories, writing a story for good communication skills, really convey your messages by telling a story. That's where I'm
So, I mean, so not just the fact that it is itself a story well told, but that it's a book about storytelling to some degree? Yeah.
I think Irving was lying to find stability also because he was driven by what he thought he should go into and what he loved to do. He was simply, as a child, he was spirited away. He wanted to come back and center. And he learned in European tradition, about their folklore that goes back hundreds, thousands of years. And so he wanted to infuse that, and he could as a writer, because it was his own world, into the place where he was familiar. Also, if you grew up there, I mean, we love going up there, because, I mean, the whole school of art and dealing with the light, and how the light is different up there, and you can sit on the bottom of the Sunnyside is possible. I wish we could live. I've never been to Burling's home on the sunny side. Do yourself a favor, go there. But you could stand there and watch about from 4
Yeah, so it is interesting the degree to which, even though the Hudson River School really came after the sketchbook, to some degree they combine, I think, in the American artistic consciousness. And I can never not think about Durant and people like that when I read Washington Irving's description of the Hudson Valley.
I mean, it's perfect for
Yeah.
tales and ghosts and, you know, I mean, and specters and visions. It's great. What hell? You know, I'm wearing a tie today.
Did you wear that in honor of the story?
No, actually, I didn't. but
He's wearing a pumpkin tie for the people.
I didn't really, but it falls nicely with the top.
Yes. Well, let me say that I did not even know the Disney movie existed until I started preparing for this talk. I read, and this is apocryphal because I don't have a footnote for this, that it was pulled out of circulation by Disney because it showed people drinking and things like that. And so therefore it hasn't been in the cycle of replayed Disney movies. So certainly the current generation has never seen it. Or heard of Bing Crosby, by the way. But that I think for an older generation is definitely, not to put you in an older generation, is part of it. Yeah.
I'd like to ask you something completely, you know, off the topic of why it's becoming popular, but, you know, here we are in the Copyright Office. I was reading up on Washington Irving that he was a very big proponent of copyright. Can you speak to that issue at all? I mean, compared to, I guess, Europe was ahead of us on copyright, scale. I guess, you know, it obviously fell into public domain. If it was ever copyrighted, you know.
So I can't speak in detail about that, but I do know that it became an enormous hit in 7 volumes in the United States. Pirated copies of it pirated may be the wrong word, just ripped off copies of it, started to appear in England. And so Washington Irving, in order to protect his financial interest in it, convinced an English publisher to publish the sketchbook in a 2-volume set. And I have also heard allusions to the fact that he used the British copyright law as it then existed to try to shut down the violators. But I really don't know much more about that. I don't know whether the people who work in the Copyright Office view Washington Irving as a you know, forefather to their work.
I've read that in several places.
Yeah, me too.
About that.
Yeah.
But I think he testified before Congress about it.
Okay.
Of course, it wasn't until 1870 that the Copyright Office came into the library. I think before that, it was registered in local jurisdictions.
Right. Right. Any other thoughts? Well, thank you. Okay.
Maybe I'm missing something here, but I'm trying to understand why is it a seasonal favorite? Is it because of, I mean, does it have any remote connection to Halloween, spirits, and so on? I never understood why it appears on TV during fall season and not, you know, spring or.
Have you read the story recently?
I have not read the
It is just soaked with autumnal imagery. It is, you just feel yourself amongst the kaleidoscopic changing leaves and the fall harvest.
Okay.
And then when you add to that the ghost and the pumpkin, to the point, by the way, where in a lot of images, the pumpkin he's holding has like a jack-o'-lantern face carved in it. I don't know where and when that started, but I think that that's why. So I think, and I do think that the fact that it's just like Jacob Marley will always live as a ghost of Christmas, I think that the Headless Horseman will always live as a ghost of Halloween in American culture. Okay.
Professor Grossman, I wish I'd had you for American Lit when I was in college. I think I would have gotten much more out of this book, and I really want to go back and read it now. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me.
Just everybody, our last law library program of the year, Tuesday, December 10th at 1 o'clock. We're hosting our annual Human Rights Day program in the Mumford Room. This year's topic is refugee rights, and we'll have 3 great speakers, so I hope you'll join us. Thank you again so much.
Thank you. Thanks.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.